The morning of December 8, 1942, broke cold and still over the dense jungle canopy of Guadalcanal, where Corporal Thomas McKenna of the 1st Marine Division lay motionless in a hastily constructed observation post. Through his scope, he watched a column of Japanese infantry moving through the clearing below, approximately 200 meters distant, their boots making soft, crushing sounds against the fallen leaves. The temperature hovered near 80 degrees Fahrenheit, but McKenna felt ice in his veins, knowing that his four-man reconnaissance team was surrounded, cut off from the main defensive line by at least 3,000 meters of hostile territory. What McKenna believed in that moment was that survival meant remaining invisible, waiting for nightfall, hoping the enemy would pass by without detecting their position. He could not have imagined that within the next 8 minutes, a single, carefully placed round would fundamentally alter the tactical situation, saving not just his team but changing how American forces in the Pacific would approach similar scenarios for the remainder of the conflict. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the account of how one Marine's unconventional thinking and precise marksmanship transformed a desperate defensive situation into a lesson in psychological warfare, proving that sometimes the most effective shot is not the one that hits its intended target, but the one that disrupts an entire enemy formation through strategic incapacitation. McKenna had enlisted in the Marine Corps in March of 1941, 9 months before the attack on Pearl Harbor. He grew up in rural Montana, the third son of a wheat farmer, where he had learned to shoot by necessity, protecting crops from deer and coyotes across vast stretches of open land. His marksmanship scores at boot camp in San Diego had been exceptional, placing him in the 98th percentile of his training class. By the time he shipped out to the Pacific Theater in July of 1942, he carried a Springfield M1903 rifle equipped with a Unertal 8-power scope, one of only 60 such rifles distributed to the 1st Marine Division. His team consisted of 4 men. Staff Sergeant Robert Hayes, a 32-year-old career Marine from Philadelphia who had served in Nicaragua during the Banana Wars, acted as team leader. Private First Class James Rodriguez from San Antonio, Texas, served as radio man, carrying the bulky SCR 300 radio that weighed 32 pounds with batteries. Private Leonard Walsh, a 19-year-old from Boston, Massachusetts, served as scout and carried a Thompson submachine gun for close defense. Together they formed Reconnaissance Team 7, tasked with monitoring Japanese movements along the inland jungle trails that fed into the American defensive perimeter around Henderson Field. The tactical situation on Guadalcanal in December of 1942 remained precarious despite American success in holding the airfield. Japanese forces controlled most of the island, approximately 25,000 troops compared to the American garrison of roughly 19,000 Marines and soldiers. The Japanese army at the time maintained superior numbers in infantry, but struggled with logistics, their supply lines constantly harassed by American air power operating from Henderson Field. Every night, Japanese destroyers and cruisers would race down what Marines called the slot, delivering troops and supplies under cover of darkness, creating what became known as the Tokyo Express. On December 7th, Team 7 had moved into position along a suspected supply route, establishing their observation post in the twisted roots of a massive banyan tree that provided both concealment and elevation. They had observed steady traffic throughout the previous afternoon, Japanese infantry moving in squad-sized elements, carrying supplies inland toward positions in the jungle interior. Hayes had radioed these observations back to battalion headquarters, providing valuable intelligence about enemy movements. Then, near dusk, their radio went silent. Rodriguez had been attempting to report an unusually large column of Japanese troops when the SCR 300 simply stopped transmitting. He checked connections, swapped batteries, adjusted the antenna, but the device remained dead. They were alone, unable to call for support or report their position, with Japanese forces moving through the jungle all around them. Hayes made the decision to remain in position through the night, rather than attempt movement in darkness through unfamiliar terrain. They would wait for dawn, then decide whether to try reaching friendly lines or find a new position to continue their observation mission. It seemed like a reasonable plan, conservative and safe. The night passed with excruciating slowness. McKenna took the first watch, peering through the darkness, listening to the jungle sounds, trying to distinguish natural noises from human movement. The air smelled of rotting vegetation and the sweet, cloying scent of tropical flowers. Mosquitoes swarmed relentlessly despite the repellent they had applied. Around midnight, they heard Japanese voices passing perhaps 50 meters from their position, speaking in low tones, the words incomprehensible, but the meaning clear. The enemy was everywhere. When dawn arrived, Hayes assembled the team for a quick conference. Rodriguez whispered that he believed the radio's problem was a blown vacuum tube, not something he could repair in the field. Walsh reported that he had counted at least 5 separate groups of Japanese troops moving past their position during the night, all heading in the same direction, inland and slightly west. McKenna added that through brief glimpses in the pre-dawn light, he had observed what appeared to be supply carriers, men bearing heavy loads on their backs. The situation had evolved from observation mission to survival scenario. Hayes decided they would move parallel to the Japanese route of march, staying hidden, looking for an opportunity to break contact and return to American lines. They would travel light, abandoning the non-functioning radio and excess equipment, moving slowly and carefully. They had traveled less than 500 meters when Walsh, moving on point, suddenly froze and raised his fist. The team went motionless. Through the vegetation ahead, they could hear voices, many voices, speaking Japanese. Walsh crept backward, his face pale. He whispered to Hayes that there was an entire company ahead, perhaps more, taking a rest break in a clearing. Hayes crawled forward to assess the situation himself, McKenna following close behind. What they saw made Hayes exhale slowly through his teeth. In a natural clearing approximately 40 meters in diameter, Japanese soldiers sat or lay on the ground, perhaps 150 men with more still filtering in from the trail. Officers stood in a cluster near the center, examining maps. The troops looked exhausted. Many had removed their boots to massage swollen feet, their uniforms dark with sweat despite the morning cool. Hayes and McKenna retreated to where Rodriguez and Walsh waited. The team leader's face showed the strain of command. He explained in barely audible whispers that they were trapped. The Japanese force blocked the most direct route to American lines. Moving around them would take them deeper into hostile territory, with no guarantee of finding a way back. Staying in place meant risking discovery when the enemy unit resumed its march. Then McKenna spoke up, his Montana drawl even more pronounced when he kept his voice low. He had an idea, he said, but it was unconventional. Hayes listened, his expression shifting from skepticism to consideration to something approaching hope. What McKenna proposed violated every principle of reconnaissance and evasion. He wanted to take a shot, not at an officer or radio operator or any of the typical high-value targets, but at one specific soldier he had observed in the clearing. A young Japanese soldier, probably no more than 20 years old, who sat apart from the others and who McKenna had noticed was wearing a specific type of pack that medics typically carried. The logic was both simple and sophisticated. If McKenna could wound this medic, not eliminate him but create an injury that required immediate attention, the entire Japanese unit would face a crisis. Their medic would need help, other soldiers would have to tend to him, the unit would be thrown into confusion and defensive posture. More importantly, standard Japanese army doctrine, as intelligence briefings had explained, placed enormous emphasis on never leaving wounded behind. The psychological impact of their own medic being struck would force them to delay their movement, establish a defensive perimeter, treat their casualty, and potentially send for additional medical support. It was psychological warfare executed through precision marksmanship. One shot to create chaos, buy time, and allow the reconnaissance team to escape while the enemy dealt with their internal crisis. Hayes considered the proposal for perhaps 30 seconds, weighing the risks. A shot would reveal their presence, but their presence would likely be discovered anyway when the Japanese unit resumed its march. A firefight between 4 Marines and 150 Japanese soldiers would have only one possible outcome. But if McKenna's plan worked, if that single shot created enough disruption, they might gain the minutes they needed to slip away while confusion reigned. Hayes gave a single nod. McKenna began his preparation. Finding the right position took 15 minutes of painstaking movement. McKenna needed a clear line of sight, stable shooting platform, and immediate exit route. He settled into a small depression beneath a fallen log, using his pack as a rifle rest, calculating distance, wind, and angle. Through his scope, the Japanese medic came into sharp focus. The young man sat cross-legged, eating rice from a small container. His medical pack clearly visible beside him, marked with the red circle that indicated medical supplies. McKenna controlled his breathing, slowing his heart rate, letting the rifle become an extension of his body. The range was 193 meters by his estimation, well within his capability. He aimed not for a lethal shot, but for the medic's shoulder, specifically targeting the area where collarbone met upper arm, an injury that would be dramatic, painful, and debilitating, but recoverable with proper treatment. He felt Hayes settle in beside him, ready to cover their withdrawal. Rodriguez and Walsh had already begun moving back along their planned escape route, staying low, ready to provide covering fire if needed. McKenna exhaled halfway, held it and squeezed the trigger. The Springfield cracked, the sound impossibly loud in the jungle quiet. Through the scope, McKenna saw the medic jerk backward, his rice container flying from his hands, his left arm suddenly useless. Then McKenna was moving, following Hayes, not looking back, trusting his shot had found its mark. Behind them, the Japanese clearing erupted in chaos exactly as McKenna had predicted. Soldiers scattered, seeking cover, officers shouting orders, trying to determine the direction of fire. But the most important reaction was the immediate response to their wounded medic. 3 soldiers rushed to him, others formed a protective circle, weapons trained outward, scanning for additional threats. The medic's screams carried through the jungle, high-pitched and terrified. The sound of a young man confronting his own mortality. His companions yelled for help, calling for medical supplies from someone else in the unit. An officer ran toward the group, demanding status reports, trying to organize a response while simultaneously ensuring their casualty received treatment. The Japanese unit, which moments before had been preparing to resume its march, now faced a complex tactical and psychological crisis. Their medic, the one man responsible for keeping them alive if they were injured, had become a casualty himself. This created a cascading series of problems. Who would treat him? How badly was he injured? Was this a single sniper or the beginning of a larger ambush? Should they pursue the attacker or establish defensive positions? Should they continue their mission or withdraw to get their medic to proper medical facilities? While Japanese officers debated these questions and soldiers scanned the jungle for threats that had already vanished, McKenna and his team were moving fast through the undergrowth, putting distance between themselves and the confused enemy unit. They moved for 30 minutes without pause, Hayes setting a brutal pace until they reached a small stream where they paused to catch their breath. Rodriguez was grinning despite the exertion. Walsh kept shaking his head in disbelief. Hayes simply looked at McKenna and said, "Well, I will be damned." It actually worked. But McKenna's innovation went beyond that immediate tactical success. The psychological impact of that single shot reverberated through Japanese units in the area for weeks afterward. When word spread that American forces were specifically targeting medics, it created profound unease among Japanese troops. Soldiers began to fear not just being wounded, but being wounded when their medic might already be incapacitated. Medical personnel, who typically moved with relative freedom in combat zones, became cautious, sometimes reluctant to expose themselves. American intelligence officers, when they learned of McKenna's action through his after-action report, recognized the broader implications. Marine Corps headquarters on Guadalcanal distributed a tactical bulletin analyzing the incident, not advocating for systematic targeting of medical personnel, which would violate international law, but recognizing how strategic disruption could be achieved through psychological effect rather than body count. The concept became known informally as disruption targeting, the practice of selecting shots not for maximum lethality, but for maximum impact on enemy unit cohesion and capability. A wounded radio operator created communication problems. A wounded officer created command confusion. A wounded medic created existential fear. Team 7 eventually made it back to American lines late on December 9th, having evaded multiple Japanese patrols during their 30-hour movement through hostile territory. They were exhausted, dehydrated, and had subsisted on emergency rations, but all 4 men returned alive. Hayes submitted his after-action report with specific commendation for McKenna's initiative and marksmanship. McKenna himself spoke little about the incident, maintaining the quiet demeanor typical of rural Montana farmers. When other Marines asked him about his shot, he would simply say that he aimed to solve a problem, not win a medal. He continued serving as a reconnaissance team marksman throughout the Guadalcanal campaign, participating in 11 more observation missions before the island was secured in February of 1943. The broader impact of his innovation appeared in training materials and tactical discussions throughout the Pacific Theater. Marine Corps snipers received instruction on psychological targeting, understanding that their role extended beyond simple elimination of enemy personnel to disruption of enemy operations. The practice required careful judgment, balancing tactical benefit against ethical considerations, but when applied appropriately, it proved remarkably effective. Japanese after-action reports captured later in the war revealed the significant impact such tactics had on troop morale. One document from a Japanese infantry regiment on New Georgia Island in mid-1943 noted that soldiers were increasingly reluctant to volunteer for medical duties, fearing they would become priority targets for American marksmen. Another report from Burma described how Japanese units had begun assigning multiple soldiers to medical roles, ensuring redundancy in case of casualties among medical personnel. The tactical innovation McKenna introduced that morning on Guadalcanal represented a broader shift in how American forces approached the Pacific War. The Japanese Army at the time emphasized spirit and determination, believing that superior morale could overcome material disadvantages. American forces increasingly relied on psychological operations, using careful application of force to undermine that morale without requiring overwhelming firepower. McKenna survived the war, returning to Montana in 1945 with a Bronze Star, a Purple Heart from a minor wound sustained on Peleliu, and a deep reluctance to discuss his experiences. He returned to farming, married his high school sweetheart in 1946, raised 4 children, and lived quietly until his passing in 1998 at the age of 76. His military records were declassified in the 1990s as part of routine archival processes. Historians studying sniper tactics in the Pacific Theater discovered his after-action reports and recognized their significance. A 2003 study by the Marine Corps University analyzed disruption targeting as practiced during the Pacific Campaign, citing McKenna's December 8th action as a foundational example of the technique. The 4 members of Reconnaissance Team 7 remained friends after the war. Hayes retired from the Marine Corps as a Master Sergeant in 1952 and settled in San Diego. Rodriguez returned to San Antonio, where he operated a radio repair shop for 40 years. Walsh became a police officer in Boston, serving for 31 years before retirement. They held reunions every 5 years, gathering to remember not just the morning when McKenna's single shot saved their lives, but the brotherhood forged through shared danger and survival. What makes McKenna's story particularly significant in the broader context of military history is how it illustrates the evolution of warfare beyond simple application of force. The Pacific War was fundamentally a conflict of logistics and psychology. Japanese forces, isolated on islands with tenuous supply lines, depended on unit cohesion and morale to maintain combat effectiveness despite material shortages. American tactics that undermined that cohesion, creating doubt and fear among enemy soldiers, often proved more effective than direct combat. McKenna's innovation came not from formal training or doctrinal instruction, but from practical problem-solving under pressure. He assessed a tactical situation, identified a vulnerability in enemy psychology, and exploited that vulnerability with precision. His background as a Montana farmer who had learned to think strategically about when and where to apply limited resources translated directly to combat effectiveness in the jungle environment of Guadalcanal. The broader lesson for military forces was that marksmanship alone does not make an effective sniper. Understanding enemy psychology, recognizing how tactical actions create psychological effects, and having the judgment to apply force strategically rather than simply lethally. These qualities separate competent shooters from exceptional combat multipliers. In the decades since the war, military organizations worldwide have incorporated these concepts into sniper training. Modern military doctrine recognizes that snipers serve multiple roles: intelligence gathering, precision elimination of high-value targets, and psychological disruption of enemy operations. McKenna's action on Guadalcanal provided an early example of that third role, demonstrating how a single well-placed shot could achieve effects far beyond the immediate tactical situation. The ethical dimensions of such tactics remain subject to discussion and debate. International humanitarian law, particularly the Geneva Conventions, provide specific protections for medical personnel. However, McKenna's action fell into a gray area. He did not target the medic because of his medical role, but because wounding that specific individual would create maximum disruption. The distinction matters in both legal and ethical terms, though the practical effect remained the same. What remains undeniable is that McKenna's decision that morning saved his team. Without the disruption created by his shot, Team 7 would likely have been discovered by the Japanese unit as it resumed its march. 4 Marines isolated behind enemy lines with no radio communication and limited ammunition would have faced overwhelming odds. Instead, they returned safely to friendly lines, continued their service throughout the campaign, and all 4 survived the war to return home. The story also illustrates the often overlooked importance of small unit actions in determining larger strategic outcomes. Guadalcanal was ultimately decided not by massive battles, but by accumulation of tactical successes, by reconnaissance teams providing intelligence, by individual Marines making good decisions under pressure, by the steady attrition of Japanese forces that could not be adequately supplied or reinforced. McKenna's shot was one small moment in a 6-month campaign, but it contributed to the larger American victory by ensuring that valuable trained reconnaissance personnel survived to continue their mission. For the Japanese soldiers in that clearing on December 8, 1942, the experience must have been profoundly unsettling. They were resting in what they believed was relatively secure territory, behind their own front lines, when suddenly their medic was struck by a shot that seemed to come from nowhere. The precision of the attack, the fact that it specifically targeted their medical personnel, and the invisibility of their attacker all contributed to a sense of vulnerability that would have affected their morale for days or weeks afterward. This psychological dimension of combat, the erosion of confidence and security, often proves more decisive than physical destruction. An army that believes it is constantly under observation, that its soldiers can be struck at any moment by invisible enemies, becomes cautious and defensive. It moves slowly, establishes excessive security, wastes time and energy, protecting against threats that may or may not exist. This was precisely the effect that American forces sought to achieve through aggressive reconnaissance and sniper operations throughout the Pacific Theater. McKenna's story also serves as a reminder that military innovation often comes from unexpected sources. He was not a professional soldier, not a career military officer educated in formal tactics. He was a farmer from Montana who understood problem-solving, who had learned through experience to think strategically about resource allocation and tactical application. When confronted with a seemingly impossible situation, he did not panic or resign himself to failure, but instead analyzed the problem and devised a creative solution. This pattern repeated throughout the American military during the Second World War. Citizen soldiers brought civilian skills and perspectives to military problems, often finding solutions that career military professionals had overlooked. McKenna's marksmanship skills came from years of practical shooting in Montana. His strategic thinking came from farming, where success depended on making smart decisions about when and where to invest limited time and resources. These civilian skills translated directly to combat effectiveness. The story resonates decades later because it illustrates timeless principles about conflict, survival, and human ingenuity under pressure. McKenna faced a situation where conventional options appeared exhausted. Rather than accepting what seemed inevitable, he identified an unconventional approach that turned disadvantage into opportunity. He used precision and psychological insight to achieve what force alone could not have accomplished. His decision to aim for a wounding shot rather than a lethal one demonstrated sophisticated understanding of the tactical situation. A lethal shot might have caused momentary confusion, but would not have created the sustained disruption that a wounded casualty produced. The Japanese unit would have mourned their loss and continued their mission, but a wounded soldier, particularly a wounded medic, created an ongoing problem that demanded immediate attention and resources. This principle, using precision to create disproportionate effects, became central to American military doctrine in subsequent decades. Modern precision strike capabilities, satellite surveillance and communications technology all serve to achieve strategic effects through careful application of force rather than overwhelming firepower. McKenna was practicing these principles with a bolt-action rifle in 1942, but the underlying logic remains relevant in contemporary military operations. For historians studying the Pacific War, McKenna's action provides insight into the daily reality of combat operations that rarely appear in broad strategic narratives. History tends to focus on major battles, strategic decisions, and commanding generals. But wars are ultimately won or lost through accumulation of small actions by ordinary soldiers, making good decisions under pressure. McKenna's shot mattered because it kept 4 trained reconnaissance Marines alive and operational. Multiply that effect across thousands of similar incidents throughout the war, and the cumulative impact becomes substantial. The story also offers a more nuanced view of combat than popular narratives often provide. McKenna did not charge enemy positions or engage in heroic last stands. He solved a tactical problem through careful analysis and precise execution. His heroism was quiet, thoughtful, and effective. This represents a different model of military excellence than the dramatic action sequences that dominate popular media, but it is no less valid or important. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Do not forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.